proposal. This is a draft. Just a reminder of where we are with the community solar project. We have not awarded the RFP, right? There was an RFP that was issued late last year. We're still working on these, on the specifics. We are probably looking at sometime in April or May to finalize the award. But in anticipation to that work, it was discussed here at I believe the November board meeting or the December board meeting, that we wanted to come back with a framework for the rate. And that's what we're going to do today. Talk about the rate formula. We're going to see this, and the reason why we're able to present a rate discussion today without having awarded the RFP is because it's a formula rate that will be applied to whatever results we get from the RFP. Another very, very important thing here is that this being a voluntary project or program, it is also considered a voluntary formula rate for customers. Therefore, we don't have to go through the more rigorous, although we did consult with our consultant, our rates consultant, the rate consultant didn't have to go through the normal lengthy process to determine whether it's fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory because of the nature of a voluntary program. We asked our consultant to use the same bar, the same quality bar in their review to say if these were not voluntary, would these meet those same standards? And the answer was yes, and Brett is going to talk about that in just a minute. The process that they went through wasn't as lengthy, but it's basically applying the same standard. So with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Mr. Brad Underwood, and he can explain to us the approach we're taking and what we're gonna propose here. If the board agrees with these, then the idea is this is going to be out for 30 days or so until the next board meeting in March. We're going to have an open comment period, and then in March, the board will have an opportunity to approve the formula rate as presented or with any changes that may happen. Yes?
Approve the rate, not approve the project.
The rate formula.
Yeah,
Excuse me.
Formula,
correct.
Not
the project. The project comes later on. Right.
Okay. All right.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for the introduction, Javier. Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Good morning.
Morning. I'm very pleased to represent the community solar team today for a pricing discussion on our community solar project, like Javier outlined. So today, got about a half a dozen subjects we'd like to get through today. We'd like to touch a little bit on the design principles of the rate itself, a little bit on program highlights. The bulk of the presentation is on pricing and rate making, and less on program highlights. But we just want to touch a little bit there while we're doing a presentation. We'd like to get into a little bit of the detail of the methodology, how it'll be priced, and maybe more importantly, why. Sample customer impact. So we just took an average bill and assumed a participation level. We'd like to give you representation of what we think that will look like to our customer owners. We'll have a little bit of a conclusion, and then kind of some next steps, some go forward thoughts. So real quick on the design principles. Originally, when the community solar team had started, we brought a bunch of folks we thought were really committed customers in, and they had some opinions on community solar, what it should look like, what it shouldn't look like. So we started with that group, and the results of that group were helpful, but they were highly fragmented. So different people thought different things, but on the front end, we started by bringing them in and kind of having a discussion on what do you guys think as our customer owners this program might look like. And then from that, we kind of hitched up with SD2, as you might imagine. Quick highlights as far as what SD2 requires of the management team: maintain fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory rate practices. And I know that's not new to anybody in here. We want to equitably assign costs across and within all the customer classes that are impacted. So the idea here, coming from SD2, is that when you equitably assign the costs, it means essentially the cost driver bears the cost. So as an example, in this particular instance for community solar, if you elect to participate in the program, you have an interest. The idea here would be that the participant would bear the costs and all the benefits of the program, as opposed to shifting those back onto non-participants. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So that's kind of where we're going with the equity statement. We want to pursue a rate process and structure changes to reflect the cost of energy and when it is used. And then in addition, the last two, offering flexibility and options. A lot of times that's what we hear from our customers. Hey, I want something that works for me. And so that looks different across different customers. And so how do we prioritize that in our rate making? And then of course, ease of understanding. In a lot of our customer research, ease of understanding is very, very important. When you get your bill, I want to open it and I want to be able to know why this is the way it is. So a continuation of the principles, we want it to be transparent and based on actual production of energy and the prior year Southwest Power Pool day ahead market pricing. So we're going to kind of go through some commentary on what these principles are, and then we're going to kind of show some graphs and some images, maybe 2/3 of the way through the presentation, that I think will really drive home some of the points. So if you could give me some grace as we're getting through the commentary, I'm going to spend a lot of time on this, and it'll probably make more sense as we go through. The valuation is consistent with how the market values current or future OPPD generation assets. So when we bid our units in, the market values them a very specific way. And so we took that sort of methodology and we tried to extrapolate it against a community solar project. Foundations of the design principles would be scalable to accommodate potential future states of large-scale adoption of distributed energy resources. So while the discussion today is primarily focused on community solar, the principles and the foundations of the rate could be used in the future as DER participation levels increase. So long term, that's kind of how we're thinking about that.
So fuzzy number,
Yeah.
large scale.
So large scale would be something to the point where it has a meaningful impact on planning. So right now, if you just used a proxy for DER participation, you might point to a net metering rate. See how many people are net metering. That's relatively small right now. In my mind, you get up to the 3, 5, 7, 10%. These things really start affecting how the organization plans and operates. So, yeah.
Brad, distributed energy resources, energy efficiency, batteries, electric vehicles, is that all the things that fall under the umbrella of DER?
Yeah, it might be noteworthy to kind of distinguish maybe between energy efficiency, where this is just sort of the avoidance of the energy usage.
Okay.
As opposed to other forms of generators that would actually produce energy. So this is probably more the latter.
More on the generation side?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so exclude EVs from that definition?
In the traditional sense that they're not generators, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Yep. And then real quick, Javier also mentioned this in his introduction to the presentation, that we did spend a lot of time with the Brattle Group, specifically Phil Hancher, talked a lot about the principles and the methodology, and he endorsed it as meeting our standard rate-making principles.
And for those, I know we have 2 new board members that haven't gone through the rate process. The Brattle Group is a consulting company that works for the board and has provided advice to the board in the past whenever there's a rate increase and you have to have an outside consultant to provide that assurance.
Thanks, Javier. So real quick, touch a little bit on program highlights, like I mentioned at the onset. The program will require a non-refundable deposit if you break before a certain duration. So if you last the duration, I'm going to kind of merge the first and second bullet point. When you pay a deposit, if you last the 5, 10-year, or 20-year, whatever you signed up for, you would get that back as refundable. But it would be non-refundable if you don't come through on the duration that you signed up for. And this really is getting at sort of the principle of predictability. As we plan and as we source these different energy solutions, it's helpful if we can create a structure where we can be predictable in participants, and that'll affect a lot of different attributes of the program. From that point, the customer can choose to offset 10 to 50% of their usage. So think of it in tranches, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And the idea here with the cap of 50 is that sort of trying to create an environment where you can get as many people to participate as possible. So if everyone signs up for 100%, sort of philosophically, you end up pushing a lot of folks out. And then in addition, and probably more importantly, in the district's latest integrated resource plan, we expressed our trajectory to go to 50% renewable for retail sales. So when you pair sort of the district's kind of supply side suite of energy offerings of generators with someone who wants to go up to 50% participation in a community solar program, they would have achieved at that point 100% renewable designation on an annual basis. Meaning, if I consume 11,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, the energy the district provides based on a 50% subscription level would be 11,000 hours, sort of conceptually. Real time it would look different, but on an annual basis, it would be 100% renewable.
Brad, going forward, a few years down the road, we could migrate even more, could we not? We could, given planning, couldn't we migrate our rate to allow more than 50%?
Yeah, I think, depending on participation and kind of the customer outreach piece, I would think that's within this group's ability to change that, yep, if we thought it was appropriate.
Brad, I'm going to ask a chicken and egg question. Which comes first, the PPA with an installation, or signing up all these customers to determine how much solar power we want out of an installation?
Great question.
My group's working on the PPA, and it is a chicken or egg. We had that discussion this morning, even as late as this morning. And what we, at least at this point, our thinking is that we go ahead and negotiate the PPA with the options for a size, and we go ahead and give the highest cost to the customers, letting them know that it could go down if we get more participation, which means we could go to a larger unit. And so we're working with the marketing team, with Julie's team, to ensure that all of that fits together. So that's kind of where we are, and that's how we're getting out of this chicken or egg, is we're going to put options in the contract for the PPAs.
Okay.
So that's in contrast to another generation model that we had down at NC2, right? We had all the contracts in place before we built it.
All the contracts in place,
With the other
meaning
people who were owning.
the participants.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason we did that is much larger,
Yeah.
right? So you want to make sure that you have that.
And the difference, another big difference is that was not a PPA, that was a construction project,
point.
right? So we actually
It's a
started
partnership.
negotiating those contracts 5 years before the unit became energized, because we had to get everyone in place before we started construction.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
Rick.
No, I don't have a follow-up there. I have different.
I mean, when we look at refundable or non-refundable deposits, depending on when you opt in and out, that may dampen some enthusiasm among some people. I mean, everybody's pro-solar energy, everybody's
Sure.
pro-motherhood
Yeah.
and anti-pollution, but when it comes to writing a check, that may give some people pause, depending on the size of that check,
If I can pile
and the
on
restrictions
there.
on it.
If I could pile on there. So am I correct in that the refund comes based on your contract term? If you're in for 5, if you're okay.
Yes,
So
sir.
the 20-year contract harkens back to what NPPD was trying to do with the municipals, that actually drove municipals out of their system. They tried to get them to buy into a 20-year rates, basically. So.
And this is optional, right? We'll test the waters, we'll see what customers, commercial, industrial, who are probably the ones that may be interested in the 10 or 20-year contract, we'll offer that as an option. We don't want to limit their contract length to just 5 years if they want 20, but they can certainly sign for 5.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different. Again, it's optional. We want to make sure that we're being open enough to be attractive to the residential customer as well as the large commercial or industrial. It might have different
But I share your concern. I think it'll dampen it, enthusiasm, and it looks like you're trying to eliminate your risk and put it on to the customer.
We are.
That is
Well,
true.
we are.
True. That is
Certainly
true.
hope so. I think the biggest concern I have with this, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I understand we're just talking about a rate structure, is
Yeah.
that if this were a static technology, then it wouldn't concern me to be talking 10 or 20 years. but this is a very rapidly advancing technology, improving the cost drivers are dropping dramatically over time. And so I can't imagine that 10 years from now, we'll look back at this installation and say, wow, is that one inefficient? There's so much better, cheaper, available power now. So how do you deal with that when you're taking a long-term PPA and trying to manage the business risk of that without it falling onto the general population of customers? It's pretty tough.
So I think, Director Trine, you made a sage point earlier, and the analogy I would use is if you ask people how many people are interested in solar, 80% of people say, yeah, why wouldn't I be interested in that? It's a beautiful technology for all these reasons, which we agree with. And then you said, okay, well, how many of you would be interested if you had a sign-up fee? And 80 becomes something like 50, 45, 40, something like that. And then you said, well, what if it was $100, $200 or whatever, and you see the participation drop. So I think that's a great point, and I think that's what we're trying to do when we say how much participation is there to try and appropriately size the facility. The other thing I think may be noteworthy related to your last point is we did a little bit of this in the IRP, and we said, hey, what would 100 megawatts do to us? And we looked at that, and we tried to socialize that, and that did come at a premium. And I think my understanding or my impression is this is the district's response in saying maybe that size of facility maybe isn't appropriate for us now for the reasons that you mentioned, but maybe we could do a smaller facility for these people that can't put it on their residences or whatever reason. But.
Well, I mean, I really support the community solar structure. I think it's far preferable to everybody putting them on their roof. Okay, I think that's vastly preferable.
Yeah.
My question is the technology ripe yet? Is it there? Is it economical? But go ahead and finish. I mean, I want to hear the rest of the presentation. Okay. Because I've probably said more than I already know about it.
No, it's great. That's great. So kind of transitioning into the methodology, when you look external to OPPD, there really isn't a consistent, kind of canned pricing methodologies, and that doesn't exist really at the national, regional, or state level. You get a lot of different pricing structures for very different reasons, and so as the team worked on that, that was one of the findings we had pretty quickly if we didn't already know about that.
You're talking strictly about community solar.
Yeah, correct. Yep. And so when we dug a little deeper, the greatest pricing variations are related to credit values. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about conceptually the different credit values and kind of what they're doing and what they mean. So we just pulled a couple of kind of, I would say, relatively well-known sort of credit value methods. And the first one is the full retail rate. So it's consistent with a net metering sort of principle, but it does result in a significant subsidization by non-participants. And what we really mean by that is if you think of a utilities cost I'm going to oversimplify this in kind of like 4 categories. You have a transmission cost, you have a distribution cost, you have a customer cost, you have a cost for the facilities on standby that you issue debt service for. And so in those 4 sort of cost categories, a participant in community solar is still using those services. They're still using those values. And so when we compare that to a full retail rate credit, that's where we get kind of challenged on, are we equitably assigning costs to participants? And then going to an embedded cost of generation. Simple approach, but gives solar equal capacity credit compared to baseload units. This is where the graphs kind of in a couple slides become terribly helpful. But what we're really saying there is if you give someone the full embedded cost of generation, essentially what you're saying with the rate making is, I don't have to carry generation for this person. This individual who's participating, they already have a generation solution. They're not going to look at me for that. And what we find with solar assets is that dependent upon where you are in the country, they don't necessarily produce at peak load. So practically what that would mean is there would be another generator producing for that solar customer when the facility is not producing at peak. And if you give them an embedded cost of generation credit, you're essentially passing the production cost or those kind of standby facilities theoretically onto non-participants. And so that's sort of where we get into the challenge with that methodology. And then the last one, value of solar.
Which Brad,
Yes,
goes
sir.
away with batteries, largely,
Yeah,
largely.
especially residential batteries. If you own the battery as a residential
Yeah.
customer, absolutely.
Hang a Tesla battery on your
Yeah,
garage wall.
Powerwall.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Brad, explain how this model is different than wind, because wind isn't a constant source of power either.
Yeah, so I guess where my mind goes when you ask that question, Director Mines, is that both produce energy at different times. So solar will follow your load profile a little bit better than wind. But primarily, I think the discussion revolves around the accredited capacity and what value the utility gets for that resource. And I think we got a couple slides.
Okay, good.
Kind of comparing and contrasting to your point, may be helpful to see.
But to recognize, I think the other difference with wind is if we were doing these similar program for wind,
Sure.
or just a subset of our customers that were just interested in wind, these same concept would apply, right? The difference with our wind is that we're including it in the entire portfolio of our generation, and we don't have, therefore the embedded cost of generation is not necessarily just attributed to one group participating in wind and the rest are not. This is where all of our ratepayers are participating in that technology equally. So it is part of our portfolio of generation, whereas this one is a subset. So that's where the embedded cost of generation makes a difference. Not everyone's charged for the same technology.
Mick, I do think that solar is more predictable than wind. You know for sure it's off all night long. Okay, every night you know it's off, whereas wind blows day and night. And so you've got a little more predictability with that. And if you site it properly within the state, I think you have some regions with more sunshine than others. And so, and it does fit the seasons better than wind. Wind tends to blow harder in the winter
That's right.
and overnight when you don't really need the power. Solar's stronger during the day in the summer. You have more hours of sunlight. And so I think there is a qualitative difference.
I agree.
So this goes back to our credit calculations, so you've got that later, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
We
Kind of
wanna
the
do
sad
that.
fact is that the capacity factor is so low still for solar
really is,
compared
yeah.
to wind. So
Okay.
So, back to your second bullet.
Yes, sir.
When you talked about
Thank you.
this, what I heard you describe in the second bullet
Yeah.
was equivalent, I thought, to the fourth element of the full retail rate, where you talked about the 4 different areas: transmission, distribution, and standby capacity.
Yeah.
Isn't that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean that's part of that second bullet for sure. If I understood your question.
I don't know, I'm just trying to grasp all the wisdom you're giving.
Yeah, I don't know about wisdom, but yeah, yep. So the third one, the value of solar. This is where you get super fragmented. You get pretty diverse opinions about that. You can ask 5 people, and pretty sure you can get 5 separate opinions. So again, as far as a consistent and uniform methodology, value of solar is really, really challenging. So like I mentioned earlier, when we're evaluating a market-based approach, we're using the Southwest Power Pool for that. The value that's expected to be received if all the energy from the community solar facility is sold into the market, and that's what we do with our existing units. That's how we receive revenue for the existing units. But within that kind of transaction structure, primarily there's 2 values there. There's an energy that's priced on a prior year actual SPP day-ahead prices. And then the capacity value is based on the SPP accreditation value compared against the capacity value based on the district's next marginal generation. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on those 2 on the next slide or 2.
Well, we're trying to keep it simple.
But again, I think to your point, Director Yoder, on equitable, kind of that last bullet point is basically if you opt into the program, all the benefits and all the costs would be yours, as opposed to a non-participant. And that's what we think this structure really does well, is it allows participants to capture all that value and also bear those costs. So real quick, this is as gory as we're going to get here. Sometimes rate making is not glamorous, but like I mentioned earlier, there's two value streams. So the energy piece is the actual hourly annual community solar production from the prior year. One thing that might be noteworthy is that this is not real-time prices. So kind of the understanding of management and the community solar team is that people who are opting into community solar are probably not doing it to capture real-time pricing variances and because they think they can do better in the market. They're probably doing it for the attributes that solar brings. And so that's what we're trying to touch right there when we say the actual annual community solar production from the prior year. We're giving them something that's predictable, that was realized in the market the prior year, that they're not subject to real-time pricing variances, which the district would be subject to. And then from a accredited capacity perspective, the annual levelized value of the next marginal generation the district would construct to serve load. A lot of times this is commonly referred to as a simple cycle or a combustion turbine, although that could be different things at different times. So mathematically what we're doing is we're taking the day ahead hourly market price and we're timesing it times the hourly production shape for the community solar. So when did you produce asset and what market value did you get for energy? And then in addition to that, we're adding the annual levelized value of the next marginal generation at the SPP accredited capacity value. So it's very important to understand that capacity factors and accredited capacity can be different things. So philosophically, a capacity factor is how much time does that asset produce? So to Director Trinan's point, you can produce in the middle of the night. If you're a wind facility, that would drive your capacity factor up. The accredited capacity is the asset's ability to produce at peak. That can be very different. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through the next couple slides. And then assuming the board was pleased with this structure, it would be updated annually once you guys had approved it. So we would not come back. Yes, sir?
I'm sorry. This is interesting. I didn't know there's going to be math today, but it's interesting. Give it to me in cents per kilowatt. What are you going to charge somebody?
Yeah, I'm gonna get
coming?
there.
All
Yep.
right, if it's coming, I'll hold my question.
Okay.
And my other question, though, is how do you update that formula annually when you have a 5, 10, or 20-year commitment from somebody? If they sign up for something and the pricing, basically you tell them the pricing's kind of variable,
Yeah.
it's going to move on them. Okay.
So
It's better,
I'll-
could be worse.
Might go down,
It's
Yeah, could go either way.
go up.
So I'll touch that real quick just to make sure I'm giving you guys enough clarity on the process. Is we would leave the formula alone and we would update the inputs into the formula from the prior year results.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So real quick, here's the promised graphs, but we wanted to give folks an understanding of what does an asset do relative to load, a solar asset do relative to load. So real quick, the orange line here is the average output of a 1 kilowatt AC solar system. And we use NREL for that, but here it is, and it's just as you would imagine. So you get into the morning hours, 6, 7, and 8, the sun comes up, and the asset starts producing. And then you run through the day here, and then you get into early evening, so this is 1700 is 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, and as the sun set, obviously the generation from the asset sets as well. And then we've overlaid here the average of the 2016 annual day-ahead hourly price. So here the generator is producing at max. Here is the price that it's going to realize right here on this green line. As the generator comes off the production cascades, you can see if you were to do a best fit line, the pricing would kind of climb till you hit peak, and then it would drop. And it's commonly understood that it drops as load goes away.
So do I get this pricing right here? That's somewhere between 1.4 cents and 2.6 cents as it's peak. That's kind of the range of daily pricing.
Yeah, so, yep, so this is just, these are averages. But yeah, on a daily, it would be more volatile, but yeah,
That's the pricing band.
that's correct.
Mary, Mrs. Fisher, what, in your SPP negotiations, what kind of pricing are we looking at? Just curious.
SPP on a daily?
I'm sorry, not SPP. On your PPA, what pricing structure are we looking at?
Yeah,
Can you share that?
I don't think we can
Yeah.
share that.
All right.
No.
Close.
Okay.
Yep. And then so real quick, kind of continuation of that kind of logic or that structure. So orange again is the expected output of a 1 kilowatt AC solar unit on our 2016 peak day. That would have occurred on 8/11/16. And then you see the load, the system demands up here, and the production of the asset according to NREL. So here's where credit values really get adjusted. Is SPP says, let's just assume this is it's a 1 kilowatt. You could accredit 20% of that 1 kilowatt. So again, capacity factor and accredited capacity, different discussions, but this is what this is trying to kind of visually show for people that may be interested. And then here's real quick on a summary. So the capacity accreditation, you'll notice all three of these sources, coal, gas, and nuclear, are all dispatchable. Obviously, that's relatively intuitive. And then we show some intermittent resources over here. So this is the highest capacity factor of OPPD's assets here for wind, for 15%. The asset has to perform over a 3-year period. And then SPP, according to its standard planning process, assigns it an accredited capacity value. Solar's a little bit higher, but clearly it's challenged relative to dispatchable assets, which is something we all already know.
In terms of implementation, do you just get like an engineering number to put in there for the first year, and then after 3 years you have an actual?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we're going to assume is the NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, that does a lot of work. We'll put those curves in and give them an immediate credit value. Normally, we'd have to wait. I appreciate that question, Director Yoder.
So I guess, just to be clear, when we build the facility, we will have to wait from an SPP perspective, but we are proposing that we give the customer the benefit of that immediately. Right?
Yep, thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
So real quick, getting to some example costs. There's a couple of factors here that are really going to influence the customer's cost to participate. So the first is the interconnected cost of the community solar facility, or the cost per kilowatt hour. The second one is the market value. So the market-based credit will be updated annually, as we mentioned, but valuation changes are primarily affected by SPP accreditation policies, energy prices, and asset performance. So to a certain extent, metaphorically, this is kind of the district sort of stepping aside and saying, this is how the market values these. And if you ask me what are the two or things that affect that, it would be the accreditation policy, the energy price, and the asset performance. So let's assume real quick that we find ourselves in a future state where carbon is regulated. Generally speaking, we would assume that energy prices would climb. Energy would be more expensive because you've suppressed some of the carbon generation. In that particular case, all of those higher yields for the energy price would be passed on to participants. And I think that's the beauty of the formula. So as the market changes, the impact to the participant changes. And of course, that would be true conversely speaking. No, I was just going to say, so the flip side is if you have a period of extended depressed pricing, obviously the participant would be subject to that as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was going to ask. What's the flip side is,
Yep.
What if carbon isn't regulated and the technology becomes so cheap that everybody's going to Home Depot and buying it for
Yep.
themselves?
And
Or there's yet a new technology
Sure.
that comes into play and displaces solar, right? It's a bunch of different circumstances, and that is something that the participants would have to right the bad times and the good times with how this technology is valued in the market.
And that's a really good articulation of just system planning challenges in general. I think that's great how you said that. Yep. And then the last one is tiered subscription level. So the volume of participation that you would like to achieve as a customer, obviously that would affect kind of your total cost. So real quick, here's an illustrative example of a sample. So we're just going to say that the interconnected community solar facility is about 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And then our approximate market-based credit would be right at about 3.6 cents. Again, just as an example. And the customer annual usage, this is for a residential customer, it's important to denote that, is about 11,000 kilowatt hours. And how much of their annual usage the customer wants to offset, we're assuming they would subscribe at a 10% level. You can, of course, scale that up at the customer's preference, but that's what we're assuming. So the rate impact, the net change in my bill as a customer resultant from those participation levels at 10% would be about 3%. So be about 3% higher, speaking in a world of averages. And then you can see the steps going all the way up to 50%, with the 50% being about 17%. And you'd step up a handful of points each tranche. So real quick, the conclusion. Yes, sir.
Lisa's not here, but I think we've talked about these when we surveyed customers, and in the focus groups we had, even the 17% would be in alignment with what customers have expressed, that they would be willing to pay up to somewhere around 20. Now, it's one thing what customers say and whether they will sign up for, but it's within that the range that we got feedback from all these customer focus groups.
Have we compared this to other rate structures for other community solar? Have we looked at, I mean, there's a couple others, these Nebraska, right?
Yeah.
Certainly in surrounding states, so have we benchmarked?
I would say that it varies. Generally speaking, as you might imagine, the larger the credit value, the cheaper this becomes. And there's a whole spectrum there in which people kind of operate.
But this is really interesting, and probably one of the most important founding blocks in my analysis when we're looking at the rate, at the formula rate we're proposing, is that it is my opinion that we are adequately sharing risk with the customer who wants this technology, which this technology may not be prime for us to include it in our IRP. It's not the cheapest one, it's probably in evolution, but we're offering it to those customers who may want it today, and we are sharing that risk and the benefit with that customer. What this does for the utility, and I think this is where I'm giving a lot of praise to the rates and pricing team, is that they designed a formula rate that is scalable. From a financial perspective and from a customer equity perspective, I don't care if this is a 5 megawatt community solar or a 500 megawatt community solar, we can make it work without it being in detriment to the rest of the customer owners. Now, those 5 megawatts or 500 megawatt participants would get the benefit of the market, and the benefit may improve or may deteriorate, and it is scalable. It is a principle that makes me, from a financial perspective, comfortable following when it comes to battery storage or other DER technologies that the district, by laying the groundwork on this type of formula, we are well positioned to take on any technology and scale it. My challenge is, as we benchmarked other utilities, we found it really hard to scale. It may work when you're giving a credit equal to the retail rate, as long as you keep that community solar project small. But if you were to increase it, at some point the rest of the customers have to start paying higher rates because of a community solar. And this formula really allows us to scale this up as much as we need to, and adapt to what the future market and the technology brings us. So that's from a purely financial perspective, that's a big advantage I see on this approach.
So you believe the dollars we collect from the participants will at least offset the dollars we pay out?
Correct. And in fact, the participants may actually collect more dollars than we're currently estimating. At that point, the participants may benefit that credit may be higher than the rate they're paying. They benefit from being early adopters. They benefit from participating in it, and not the rest of the customers. So that speaks to the equitable distribution of costs principle in our SD2.
But what I think we're missing here a little bit are the advantages OPPD gets as an administrator of the soft costs that are not calculated in here of learning to do something new, right? I mean, all of the risk is given to, you said we're sharing, I'm not seeing where we're sharing. All the risk is assigned to the customer at this point, and yet we're training ourselves how to do this. This is part of that looking forward and being proactive and looking ahead to what new technologies may come. We have to build those skills. There's a cost in building those skills. This is a way of building those skills. And do these customers alone bear that cost?
So that's a good point. A couple comments. One is customers certainly are bearing some of the risks as fluctuations in the prices happen, but I think we're bearing risks as well as if we don't get the kind of signups that we were anticipating, right? Like there can be that's one of the risks for us. I mean, zooming out a little bit, I was recently at a conference with a bunch of higher ed people working to go carbon neutral. And there was a fascinating story by a East Coast liberal arts university who was paying obscene amounts of money for their energy because their utility rates were ungodly high. They recently signed a PPA to go 100% solar, and had a huge battle with the utility trying to figure out what exactly that meant for them. When I had a conversation with the president of the university after the fact, I asked him, I said, well, so could you have justified doing this if the utility was already at 80, 90, or 100% renewable energy? He said, no way. Like, even the financial implications wouldn't have mattered. So to me, it's something that you talked about earlier. Customers that are looking at something like this they're thinking, should I do it on my roof or should I participate? That to me is kind of one of the challenges, and we have an opportunity to figure out and actively work to try and direct them one way or another. To what extent do we want control with community solar, albeit some risks, but I think they're risks that are manageable, and we can learn a lot about what the future will hold for us versus us saying, yeah, this isn't right for us yet. I think we're going to see additional defection, which is a concern. The objective for these people is really about cleaner energy.
Yeah.
In most cases.
Yes, I agree.
And we don't have the same cost pressures that the East Coast schools have by any stretch.
Yeah.
But the objective's different.
Well, my concern is once you get far enough down the road and the technology gets so much cheaper, people won't care about their non-refundable deposits. They'll say, well, it's $50 and I can do this much cheaper now, so keep my $50, I'm out. And at a certain point in time, you don't have enough subscribers to pay the cost, and there's only one place that can go, and that's on the rest of the population that doesn't subscribe. So, the fact that if we're gonna sign a PPA for 20 years and don't have that similar offsetting commitment, ironclad commitment, that's a risk, a business risk, that the smaller it is, the more acceptable it is. The larger it is, the less acceptable it is. There was an article in the Wall Street back in November about Germany as a country decided to go shut their nukes, shut a lot of their coal down, and go wind and solar. The average German today pays 36 cents a kilowatt hour for their power versus an American average of about 11 or 12. Okay. It's proven to be kind of disastrous for them. And it isn't because it's wrong. It may just be because of the timing. It's just, maybe they got a little ahead of themselves. Maybe they got a lot ahead of themselves. So there's some blowback in that country against wind and solar now because it's so expensive. So I want to see eventually what we're signing up for. That's maybe more important to me than the rate structure. I think you've done a really nice job on the rate structure, okay? It remains to be seen what the acceptance will be as it wiggles going forward, okay? But, I'm open-minded about that part of it. I'm more concerned about, Mary, what you guys are negotiating in terms
That's
of.
something that we'll bring back into
Yeah.
once we get there.
Yeah, and how big it all is.
Correct,
okay?
correct.
I don't mind a toe in the water, but
What's your big finish?
Well, thank you for that transition. So real quick, we tried to stay real tight with SD2 and SD13. You'll notice we started with a stakeholder outreach on the front end. I believe Mr. Karloff brought back an update in November, December. We're going to have a comment period now, so we're trying to make sure that our touch points with those that are interested are healthy and strong and frequent. We do acknowledge that the credit value is lower than some. We're not agnostic to that. We understand that there are differences, and I think we've talked about maybe some of those as we've gone through the information today. And we believe we meet the OPPD requirement of fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory, which is also a state law. And again, the proposed pricing lays the foundation for higher levels of DER participation. What the team sees as next steps is that the customer comment period would begin today. We would use our OPPD Listens tool to interact with those people who would like to give us feedback on the proposal. We'll report those comments back to the board. And then it's our hope that in the March board meeting, we would report back on the public comments and that we would seek a resolution establishing the rider for those interested customers. And pending any other questions, that's the end of my information. Yeah.
Just so I understand, so when I read that last bullet, it basically says, we're going to report back on comments and seek resolution, right? There's nothing in the middle which might suggest that based on the comments we've received, we might tweak the rate formula.
Yeah, it's a correct interpretation, and I think part of the team's philosophy is we have had some of those interactions.
Okay.
I don't know if we've had totally enough, but that's kind of the philosophy.
So the outreach and engagement has already, for the most part, happened.
Well, it has certainly happened at some levels, yeah.
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 Okay.
We will, though, review your comments.
Of course.
And understand if that has any material effect on the approach that we've taken.
Yeah.
And the board will get a summary of those.
Correct.
Every week I will provide you a summary of anything that comes in.
And this is available to all OPPD customers?
Yes, sir.
Customer owners? Which is it?
Customer owners, I believe is correct, yeah.
or just customers.
Just customer owners, yes.
And I'm wondering whether or not, since we have a very short meeting, whether or not we should replay this whole presentation on Thursday. I know we normally don't do that, but whether or not, since I don't think there's not too many public are here today, whether or not I don't know.
What do you think?
I don't think
I think it's premature.
Premature.
It would be interesting to see what the comments are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In regards to that. So before.
We're gonna hear it again in March anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're gonna hear it in March.
Yes.
So people will be able to watch it on the website
Sure.
before they comment.
Okay, and
Sure.
if you have the comment, can you just have that one section so they don't have to go through the entire meeting?
that would be great.
That would be,
Like
you know,
trying to
you
sift
can have the
through 8
entire
hours of
meeting,
committee
but,
meeting.
but if you could just have
Right.
just one
No, I
section.
think that's a good idea.
That'd be great.
You know, have two different things, have the whole board meeting in one, and this specifically with a link to go to this to listen.
And have
Yeah,
the-
they do that with other presentations
Yeah.
or the
Okay.
president's report, for example, so we can have them do
Will
that.
the presentation be available as a download? I mean, just the PowerPoint?
Yes, all materials will be available.
All bases covered.
Good.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Brad, great job.
That was good.